You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis with BioHealth Innovation and your host of BioTalk. And today we have a very local guest in the biohealth capital region, embedded with a company that has a nice history here in the Montgomery County area. But he's a relatively new CEO to the company. And we welcome Peter Ronco, who is the CEO of Emmes, to BioTalk. Peter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And rather than me introduce you from your resume or your LinkedIn profile, it's always better that the interviewee do a self-introduction because you know better what listeners would like to know about you and what you're proud of, Peter. So give us a little bit of your background to get to where you are today.
Perfect. Thanks. I will do, Rich. And I'm not just a relatively new CEO to the region. I'm new to the region. I'm, as you can tell from the accent, born and bred in England, but lived in New Jersey for 30 years. The accent has not yet come through.
Okay.
But I've spent about the last year down in Maryland. I'll tell you why. I'll explain my journey to get there. I've spent the last 30 years in pharmaceutical R&D, mostly with large pharma companies, both with Pfizer, with Bristol Myers Squibb, and then most recently at Johnson & Johnson. I headed up their global development group, and that's essentially the group that runs all their clinical trials from phase 1 all the way through to phase 4 across all the therapeutic areas and around the world. And I've loved being part of an R&D environment and R&D infrastructure. I left J&J and joined a company called Emmes. Emmes is based out of Rockville, Maryland, has been for 47 years. And so for the last year or so, I have been CEO of Emmes and spending my weeks down in Rockville and my weekends back up here in New Jersey.
We all know how the commute works and this virtual and hybrid world that we work in, Peter. So we're glad that you're in Rockville for most of your time because we're the beneficiary of that and your family has to sacrifice a little bit. But we know that that will pay dividends long term for both of you.
I have a son who's based in Virginia in college, and my wife is spending time down really exploring the region too. So we're empty nesters at this point. So it works out well. And Rockville has been a great home. It's been great to get to the local environment. Emmes has been there for 47 years. This is a company that built its initial foundation. It was founded by statisticians supporting the NIH. That's why we're based in Rockville. And over the 47 years, we have grown to be one of the top 3 providers to the NIH in a whole series of clinical research and clinical development activities. Right now, about half our business is with the US government, half is with biopharma companies. Everyone from large top 5 biopharmaceutical companies all the way through to single asset biotechs that are really just starting out. We service across all those areas in areas like vaccines and infectious disease, ophthalmology, neuroscience, as well as cell and gene therapy. So that balance of the government work as well as the biopharma work make Rockville a great place to continue to be.
Well, thank you for that history. We're proud to have Emmes located within the Rockville, Montgomery County area in the biohealth capital region, and it is one of the more rapidly growing companies in the region. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of employees that you're bringing into the company today versus the way that it has organically grown to where it is later. But tell me a little bit about clinical development and R&D. And you've been in the R&D world and clinical development for many years and decades. What's changing or what's broken in it, why they need somebody like an Emmes to get involved?
A couple of areas to start with. Clinical development is by nature a really conservative business. You're testing medicines in humans. You should be conservative. You should be appropriately risk averse. But being risk averse around safety and making sure that patients are well taken care of is different than being risky around processes and technology. And we should be willing to take more risks. And over the course of the 30-year career that I've been part of, we went from a fully paper-based approach where it was all done with binders and sticky notes and eventually fax machines. And that makes me sound old. And yes, I get it. But all the way through to a sort of kind of technology-led. There are still an amazing amount of paper in the healthcare system. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is to say, over the last 4 or 5 years, 2 things have happened in my mind. One is technology has always been a growing part of clinical development. I'd love to talk more about that later, but we've seen such significant rises in technology, particularly large language models, AI, data science, going from ideas to actually being able to implement change. That's one big change. So finally, the technology has caught up with the ideas that we've had for 10, 15, 20 years. That's the first piece. Secondly, COVID. COVID was obviously an incredibly difficult time for many people, and it was a very disruptive time for clinical development. But it was also the biggest area of growth because we were forced to do things differently. We were forced to look at technology. We were forced to work remotely to continue to develop not just the COVID vaccines, but a whole series of other medicines that were needed. And so, again, the combination of the technology and the fact that COVID showed that we could do things differently have really made it an opportunity to turn things on its head a little bit. And what does that look like? Again, the basic premise of clinical development is you want to make sure the drug is safe and you want to make sure the drug is effective and it works. And then you want to make sure as you get closer to approval that it's going to be significantly better than other drugs that exist, because otherwise people don't want to take them and you can't justify asking for people to pay for them. So that's the kind of the premise of clinical development, and where technology and the changes that have come through COVID make that quicker. So in other words, we can find out whether drugs work, or the idea is how can you make them fail quickly? You can find it quicker. You can be doing it much cheaper, because if you do it cheaper and you can do it more effectively, you can get the drugs to market quicker in a much more effective way. And then finally, more patient-centric. Being a patient on a clinical trial hasn't always been a great experience. In fact, it's been a very negative experience for many. I've had friends and close family relatives that have been part of studies. And we as an industry have an obligation to say, how can we use technology to fit into people's lives rather than causing them to show up every couple of weeks just to have their blood pressure taken? We can do that at home. That's where technology can really help.
Well, technology has evolved over centuries and decades. More recently, and you mentioned language, AI, data sciences as some of the up and coming technologies. But if you look at healthcare, they haven't been sometimes the fastest to adapt to new technologies, and it takes a little bit longer. And some of the past technology revolutions in healthcare, some of them worked, some of them didn't. So what do you think we can learn from some of the past technology revolutions we've had and what we're going through today for the healthcare leaders?
So a couple of things. Standards are our friend when you're trying to talk about making progress. And unfortunately, this is where the US is not great, because we have such a fragmented approach that all of our electronic medical records and our systems differ between states and between hospitals and even between departments in hospitals. So it's really hard to push any type of technology change through when you're doing it. It was such a distributed model. There are other countries around the world, particularly those that have more of a nationalized health, that have more of a single standard. And that is actually easier to showcase the technology improvements around that. So that's one piece. The other piece that I think that needs to be kept in mind is that upfront thinking about what is the impact on patient privacy? What is the impact on how this will actually fit into patients' lives? If all you're doing is adding another technology burden to an already stressed process, it will not work. I run a couple of trials right now in emergency rooms. The last thing you need is to add more systems and more logins and password resets and data collection to an emergency room. You have to be simplifying it, and you have to be working with the people who are going to have to use this. So I think in the past, as an industry, we've deployed technology saying, this is smart. If we do this, people will start using it. And what we found is that they did exactly the opposite. They worked around it for a whole bunch of reasons. It was too complex, it added more work to their lives, as opposed to starting from the beginning and saying the technology, which should simplify how we gather data from patients and gather data from hospitals, has to be done in a way that fits in with the ways of working and the stresses that these people are working under on a day-to-day basis.
And when you talk about AI, and I'm going to digress just a little bit, it's somewhat controversial today because people don't know what's involved in AI, who is capturing the data, who's accessing data, how's it protected. So tell me a little bit how you believe that AI is going to improve clinical trials and the clinical development process potentially in the future.
Yeah, so I think that, and I'm going to this with an appropriate dose of questioning, because I think you're absolutely right, Rich. There are questions that we, not just in healthcare, but across the rest of humanity, are struggling with. Okay, what does this actually mean? And at what point does human control really stop being part of the process? at least the way that I view this and how we're rolling this out, is there's still an integral role of humans in making sure that the decisions that are made and the way that clinical trials are run are going through that human filter, that human decision making. Where I see AI really being helpful is getting to that decision quicker, because we're bringing data together, we're bringing various different insights together to help set it up for decision makers. That's number one. Number two, making better decisions. So many times all we do is repeat what we did 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And that's true in clinical research. You remember a clinical trial you ran 5 years ago and you say, well, we're going to do the same thing again with a different drug. As opposed to really using tools, AI tools, to be able to mine all of the data that exists around, not just in your hospital, in your country, but across the entire globe, in your disease area, to pull all that together and serve it up to say, this is the best thinking that we have, that you, as the physician or the statistician or the individual who's actually going to make that final call, can get to a quicker decision and a better decision. So it's not just about taking time out. AI, when used appropriately and when it's been tuned and is taking insights, actually can lead you up to ideas and paths that are different than you would have come up to on your own.
You know, what's interesting, I've had Emmes on the BioHealth Innovation board for several years now, but I've never talked to someone from Emmes about technology as much as I'm talking to you about technology. And I think something else that's evolved that I'd like to learn more about is the Emmes Group that's been created within Emmes, and really how that's connected to the technology and scientific innovation changes going on within Emmes. And also, I think that there's been a recent acquisition or a partnership with a company called Veridix AI that Emmes is involved with as well. So talk a little bit about this Emmes Group and Veridix and how it's all related today.
So we're one company, the Emmes Group. That's one company, one legal entity based here in Rockville. And what we did is we created essentially two units. One that I run, which is the contract research organization. We run clinical research both for the government as well as for biopharma companies. We also created almost like a sister company, Veridix AI. And this is the data science technology engine that we partner together on a number of different projects. So Veridix AI, again, part of the same company, is doing data science work for a number of the NIH institutions, is helping to look at visual certification when you're running ophthalmology studies. How do you make sure that people are appropriately trained? It's using large language models and AI to really rethink how you capture and generate clinical data in a fast way. So it was created for exactly the reason that you highlighted, which is we believe that there is a really good opportunity right now with the influence of technology, as well as, to be honest, the ability of technology to actually do what we want it to do. This is an incredible time of both scientific innovation and technology innovation. And by creating these two companies, Emmes and Veridix AI, together we are looking at how do you overhaul all aspects of running clinical trials, from the beginning, where you're thinking about how to design it, through the middle, and you're talking about how to gather data and how to recruit patients into a clinical study. And then on the back end, how do you take the data, analyze it, and serve it up to both regulators and payers and patients in a much more easy to digest way. So that's why Veridix AI was created. And it was really part of this overall strategy to combine both the technology and the scientific innovation together to kind of set the stage for the future. And that's what makes me so excited about this opportunity. I've complained about inflexible technology in clinical research for far too many years. And now I have a chance to be part of the solution. And where I see Emmes and Emmes Group is really helping to lead the way in that.
Well, your enthusiasm is coming through on this podcast, Peter. So keep that enthusiasm going. But one of the challenges to grow companies, whether it's organic or through acquisition, is having talented people around you. And when you're talking about this new technology, AI, machine learning, quantum and everything, data scientists that are needed, how are you finding the talent that's necessary to fuel your rapid growth that you're going through right now in these emerging technology areas?
So it starts at the top. I have some great partners. So as part of the Emmes Group, I work with the co-CEOs of a company, or used to be with the co-CEOs of a company of Metadata, which is one of the leaders in how data are captured and generated at hospitals. These are leaders, Sashi Chilakari and Ramakondru, who've spent many, many years building technology solutions and then applying it in the healthcare space. And so with their insights about how to make this work and how to really change the landscape of technology, and my background in how to run technology, together, we're kind of bringing this all together in a single vision. So it starts at the top. Secondly, we were lucky within Emmes for the last 47 years. We've been working with the NIH to build out technology solutions. And sometimes people view government groups as being non-innovative or not willing to push the envelope. And I would push back strongly against that. What I've seen within the NIH is actually a real willingness to innovate and to look at different ways of generating data, managing data in ways that are actually extremely cutting edge. And so we have that history and that base of how we have worked with the NIH, a number of those divisions, over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And then finally, particularly in the technology space, it's a global sport. We're headquartered in Rockville. We have a number of talented leaders based here. But we also have hubs. We have hubs in Bangalore, India, in Prague, in Eastern Europe, and in Colombia, in Central America. How do you harness the global talent to make sure that you can get the best and brightest to help drive that technology piece forward?
And I would imagine the COVID revolution basically instilled in you the ability for more hybrid ability to work with partners all over the world, which is actually helping to fuel your growth as well as maintain and control your costs and your profitability.
One of the things I love about clinical development is it is a global activity. I'm not just developing drugs for the Americans. I'm developing drugs for the entire world. And some drugs and some medicines are more needed in other countries around the world. And that's where you run the research. So I love the fact that I wake up every day, not quite sure which country I'm going to be talking to and where the issue of the day is going to come from. That's part of the beauty of clinical development on a global basis. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think the advances that we've made and just the changes in work style during COVID have actually enabled us, have stressed us all, but have enabled us to emerge the other side with a much more flexible, much more productive working way.
In addition to talent for growing companies, you need money to fuel your growth. And you've had a great new partnership with New Mountain Capital to come in as a strategic partner with Emmes. Talk a little bit about your partnership with New Mountain Capital and how they're influencing the direction the growth of Emmes is going right now.
Yeah, so New Mountain Capital have owned Emmes for just about 2 years right now. And what attracted them to Emmes was their approach to many of their investments is to look at defensive growth areas. So in other words, areas that are going to grow, but grow in a steady way, not spike one year and drop the next. And clinical development is certainly a steady growth industry. And then how do you then build good operating principles and the addition of technology to help drive that growth? And they've done that a couple of times in the healthcare space with other companies over the last number of years. So they have a track record of understanding, here's how we make this work within the healthcare environment with its very unique regulations. And here's how we can, though, really be industry leaders in applying that. And so New Mountain have been actually very supportive in both helping to shape the thesis and what we're trying to do, but then also provide money. Because some of the growth can be done by growing the company. And that's part of my day job. How do we grow the company, do more work, broader work, and then use that to reinvest in our technology? But some of it is also by acquisition as well. And you look and say, sometimes you can build it yourself, but sometimes it's better to buy. And that's part of my day job as well, is to understand how to balance those two dynamics together.
And Emmes has been very acquisitive over the last year, too. And that really has expanded your global footprint, as you have mentioned it. And you have a new partnership that's just been, I think, announced recently with Mimansa AI. Talk a little bit about Mimansa and how their AI technology really assists you with your CRO involvement and CRO work that you do.
Yeah, so if you think about large language models, most of us can name ChatGPT at least, and most of us have played around in ChatGPT at least to a little bit. But that is a public large language model. It is training, it's being trained on public data, it's using public data, and things that you put into it have some level of public facing. When you talk about healthcare, that becomes really problematic because healthcare data has to have regulations, should have regulations around it. And when you're talking about how can I move my medicine forward quicker, there's a competitive nature that companies don't want to share. And so this idea of having a private large language model is actually a much more appropriate way to go in the healthcare environment. And so Mimansa does exactly that. They have built a private large language model tool, which is able to do a lot of the things that I talk about here. So when we talk about how do you write a clinical trial protocol and how do you do it really quickly by pulling all the available sources, I can do that in ChatGPT, but number one, it's public. Number two, the quality is going to be highly, highly variable because it's looking at a whole bunch of other stuff that I really don't want it to look at, as opposed to more of a private-based large language model that you can feed it with more than sufficient data. And after 47 years, Emmes has a ton of data that we can use, and we obviously go to work with partners that also have a ton of data and information, but it's then targeted and trained on those type of data sources. That makes it a far more appropriate way of using and applying AI than it would be just to start throwing stuff into ChatGPT and seeing what happens.
Well, thank you on that. And everything seems to be technology focused in the direction you're headed forward. But you mentioned also dealing with the federal government sometimes, people don't understand how innovative the federal government is. For BioHealth Innovation, a high percentage of our business now is being done with National Institute of Health, with our entrepreneurs in residence, with ARPA-H, the new emerging agency, multi-billion-dollar agency. Both of them are funding high-risk research that otherwise investors or other companies would not be willing to fund. So they're funding a lot of the innovation that actually ends up being some of the new therapeutics, devices, vaccines, drugs that we see in the future that wouldn't hit the marketplace without their willingness to take those risks. So talk a little bit about, you've mentioned NIH and how critical it is. We're fortunate enough to have 27 research institutes in our backyard in Bethesda, Maryland, with 6,000 scientists doing this work for people around the world. Talk a little bit about this, Emmes, and how NIH is propelling this growth with you.
Yeah, so if you think about the role that the NIH has played, they obviously do research in many, many disease areas, but they particularly play in disease areas that the private sector wouldn't necessarily be running towards. So, for example, we do a whole bunch of work in substance use disorder, huge unmet medical issue around how individuals for opioids and alcohol, but that's not research that would typically be done by a biopharmaceutical company. And that's where groups like the NIH really play such an invaluable role to help complement and fill out the gap of research. So that's been true since they've been founded. I think what I have increasingly grown an appreciation for is the level of process innovation underneath that. In other words, when I talk to some of the key stakeholders within each of the divisions, there is such an appetite for asking about how can we be more efficient? How can we use data science and AI and large language models to help improve how we capture data, manage data, use data? And they're under a fiduciary obligation to be appropriately spending the money in that way. And so it's been great conversations to have. And what we end up doing is doing essentially technology demo days where we'll showcase and just say, here's all the things that we can do. And they will then pick and choose and say, okay, for the business problems that our division is looking at, here are the different things that make sense for us to be using. So I've been incredibly and pleasantly surprised by the appetite and the enthusiasm for taking what is coming from a technology standpoint and saying, how can we apply that not just to the private sector, but to the public sector through NIH?
Well, we've seen how Emmes has evolved for 47 years to where you are today. Let's take a look at the future. Where do you think you're going to help drive Emmes to in the next year to 18 months, as well as the next 3 to 5 years? What are the things that you see that are going to be the major changes and developments to continue your growth as it is now?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think we're going to see data science, large language models, AI approaches move from being pilots to being standard operating procedures. In other words, not just something you try and see if it works, but actually something that is used consistently across the industry. And Emmes and Emmes Group and Veridix AI together want to be at the forefront of saying we're going to be first in line to help showcase that and be able to give that to customers. That's the first piece. Secondly, I think we're going to, as an industry, work through how do we grow that quickly with the right quality. We can't wait 3 years, 5 years, and then say, yeah, let's figure out how we make sure we manage this. In the same way that we as a society are trying to figure out how do we manage a lot of the AI work and what's the impact of AI within college applications and college grades. We're doing the same thing right now to say, how do we ensure that the use of AI is done responsibly, with control and with quality oversight? We have to do that from the beginning, because I think if we do that, over the next 3 to 5 years, you'll get more acceptance that it's not risky. That's just the way things are run. And then the final piece that I hope over the next 3 to 5 years is that it will have a material impact on how people who are part of clinical research will engage with technology. Let me just make it really very, very specific. A lot of people who are participating in clinical research have diseases where they've run out of options. They're doing this because they've tried all the therapies that exist and they didn't work. And so these are desperate individuals, desperate families, and this is the cure. This is their opportunity. And if it's not going to work for them, they want to be part of the solution so that the next generation of individuals won't have to suffer like they did. It's an incredible privilege and a responsibility for us to ensure that's done appropriately. And I've had some family members who've been part of clinical trials, including in oncology programs, where you're trying to make sure that the technology fits in their lives, not the other way around. You're not saying you have to use this app, and I want you to make sure that you are checking in X number of times per week. It has to be built into their lives because their lives are busy enough and they should be spending their time with their family, with their friends, really making the most of every single minute. So I hope, and I am very optimistic, that the improvements in technology will turn into more consumer grade ways of working so that as new people are part of oncology programs, immunology programs, et cetera, that the burden of being part of that research is significantly dropped. That helps everyone. More people will be part of the research, will get to solutions quicker, will understand whether things work. So to me, that's what keeps me excited. It's not just technology for technology's sake. It's not just because you can squeeze one more percentage of speed out of a process. It's really that I think we are getting closer and closer to a point where it actually can be built into how we operate on a day-to-day basis. And that to me is the end goal.
Yeah, I'm sure that your drive to improve the quality of life through what Emmes can do every day is what keeps you coming back to work every day.
It is. I mean, I'm an accidental R&D guy. I always describe myself. When I graduated from college, I had no clue I was going to move into R&D. I fell in love with R&D because the work that we do in developing medicines, and again, most medicines fail. Okay, there's only a few that come to market, but the impact that that can have on people, either improving or extending human life, is a privilege. And on a day-to-day basis, my job and others' jobs can be somewhat tedious and they can be annoying and there's frustrations and things don't work. But at the end of the day, when I lay my head on a pillow, Emmes and others that are involved in clinical development are helping to identify and discover new medicines to change diseases. And that is really cool. And that gives me such a great optimism, but also just a charge that we need to keep moving forward.
Well, I'm sure our listeners have enjoyed listening to Peter Ronco, the CEO of Emmes. And Peter, is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like the listeners to know about yourself, Emmes, the industry, the future that you think would be enlightening for them?
The closing comment I think I would make is, until about 5 years ago, no one really knew what clinical research was unless you actually worked in clinical research. COVID raised it to the forefront of everyone. Everyone suddenly became an expert on phase 1 clinical trials and phase 3 clinical trials and how you run them and all the different pieces. And that's great. It raised the awareness. It also raised a whole series of other views on good, bad, and ugly around clinical research. But it raised the awareness. And that is a good thing. That is a really good thing because, as I said earlier, it's such a responsibility to have folks who are putting themselves forward to be part of a clinical trial. And we have to take that with the utmost seriousness and the utmost respect. And the more that we can shed light on this and do that in a way using technology, using the approaches we've talked about over the last half hour to really make things simpler and streamlined, that to me is a wonderful thing because there are diseases that we still have very, very little viewpoint on. If you look at a lot of the mental health areas, including Alzheimer's, if you look at the breadth of cancers that we are still struggling with and are still a death sentence, there is plenty of work left to be done. And it is a global sport and it requires a number of folks to participate. So again, although I wish we hadn't had to go through COVID, obviously, it has had massive positive benefits and just raising the awareness of what clinical research is and how together it can truly help change the landscape for medicine.
It really also demonstrated that private-public partnerships are critical for all of us to survive. And COVID was one of the best examples because you look at what BARDA did with its funding within a very short period of time and the amount of time it took to get from basic research to a final product in the marketplace that was affecting people's lives. That couldn't have happened by industry doing it by themselves, actually.
100%. And again, I was privileged enough to be part of one of the teams at J&J that was driving that. And on a daily basis, working with our counterparts and in the government who would come to every conversation saying, what can we do to help? And working with groups as diverse as the US Army that I had never worked with before, but they were instrumental in operationally and logistically helping with. That was amazing. It wasn't just money. It was throwing their arms, their brains, their efforts behind it. It was an amazing experience.
Well, Peter, CEO of Emmes, based in Rockville, global corporation. We're glad you're in the BioHealth Capital Region. We hope you have at least 47 more years of productive growth with the corporation. And thank you very much for being on BioTalk today.
Thanks, Rich. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.